Good morning and welcome back to the English online lecture series organized by Department of English, KKM College Jammu and YouTube channel English Literature Briefs. Today is the sixth day of the online lecture series, and earlier we have covered so many aspects, so many topics related to the syllabus of UG and PG students. And today we are back with poetry. We have two speakers today, where the first one will talk about modern poetry, poetry of D.H. Lawrence, and the next one will talk about pre-independence Indian poetry, the poetry of Toru Dutt. So I'm extremely glad and extremely happy to introduce the first speaker today, who is Mir Muhammad Ali. He's very close to me, and let me take about your bio. Mir Muhammad Ali began his career in academia in 215 and is presently as assistant professor and head of the Department of English in Sankrail A.B.S. Mahavidyalaya, which is affiliated to University West Bengal. He is pursuing his PhD on postmodern rewriting from Ravenshaw University. He is passionate about Shakespeare and the European Renaissance. His other interests include metaphysical poetry, postcolonial literature, new literature, and culture studies, modern literature and cultures. Besides, Professor Ali loves poetry, theater, photography, and movies. So this is Mir, and I'm quite sure he will glue you to the screen with his inspiring talk. So over to you, Mir.
Thank you. Am I audible and visible, Anindada?
Yes, you are.
Am I audible?
Yes. You are clearly
Okay,
audible.
thank you. Thank you so much, Anindada, for this generous introduction. A very good morning to all of you. I thank Dr. Anindo Sundar Pole, the head of the Department of English in KKM College, a constituent college of TM Bhagalpur University in Bihar, for inviting me to give a web lecture on D.H. Lawrence's Snake for the students. I also extend my gratitude and congratulate the organizers, the principal, as well as the faculty members of this department for this great initiative. Onyudoda had been a very good mentor and my elder brother and a very good friend of mine since my Ravensa days. We used to take long walks. We used to take, fried chicken in ice. So we had pleasant memories. Thank you so much, Onyudoda, once again. Now let us directly move to the discussion of D.H. Lawrence's Snake. But before going to talk about the poem and making a commentary or analyzing this particular poem, let me just very quickly give you a brief background of reading this poem. And I will begin with the present crisis that we all are witnessing at this moment, that is the crisis of COVID-19. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic crisis is one of the most unprecedented crises of our generation. The big concepts, the buzzwords like globalization, urbanization, and the big institutions have been completely collapsed as a result of this pandemic crisis. The results of ecocide, that is the killing of the nature, as well as eco-terrorism, eco-imperialism, are immensely devastating the human lives. Climate change, global warming, rise in the sea levels, as well as a series of catastrophes like earthquake, flood, droughts, etc., may be interpreted as nature's reaction to humans' improper handling of it. That is to say that modern life is devoid of harmony with nature, and therefore nature is taking a kind of revenge upon the human being. And the only way to survive, the only way for our survival is to return to nature. The I will refer to one YouTube video that was very popular a couple of months back in the month of April, when India had its first phase of lockdown. I'm quite sure that some of you have probably watched that video where it was shown that how the penguins, how the animals, the cattle, they have come to the human habitat. Birds, penguins, animals, dolphins, they have come to the street. They were crossing the airports, waterways, etc. So it is an instance of saying that earth is a dwelling place for all of us. It is not only the property of the human beings, but we live in a vast edifice of this earth, and here the coexistence of the human beings as well as the non-human beings, like the plants, like the animals and the birds, are equally as important as our own existence is. Therefore, there is a renewed interest of writing by the eco writers. There is a group of writers who are called eco-critical writers. Now they make a wake-up call through their writings to return to nature. My present talk presses on D.H. Lawrence's poems in line with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and it depicts the link between the humans and nature, and it expresses their eco-consciousness by saying that it is not wise on the part of the human beings to harm or try to harm the non-human creatures. It is important for all of us to make a coexistence, mutual coexistence, and having a respect or dignity towards one another in this planet, in our planet. And I will begin from this particular point, our discussion of D.H. Lawrence. Now, as you know that D.H. Lawrence is a very popular novelist, and his novels like The Rainbow, Women in Love, Sons and Lovers, as well as the most controversial one, Lady Chatterley's Lover, were so popular and it was so reputed that we often underrate or we often unremarked that he is also a poet throughout his career. He had published 10 volumes of verses. His complete poems in 3 volumes contain over 1,000 private separate poems. So he is not only a novelist, but he is also a poet. And he's a poet who had composed more than 1,000 poems, separate poems. So we're going to discuss today Lawrence as a poet, not as a novelist. Now, among the 10 volumes that I have talked about, the one volume of poems that is very well critically acclaimed is definitely the collection named Birds, Beasts, and Flowers, which was published in the year 1923. So, Birds, Beasts, and Flowers was published in the year 1923. Now, why this is important, this collection Birds, Beasts, and Flowers? First of all, it is a collection from which our present poem Snake has been taken. But more importantly, Birds, Beasts, and Flowers is unique among Lawrence's verses in that it focuses on the natural world in all its multifaceted way. So the collection focuses on the natural world. From the title itself, you can understand that it talks about birds, it talks about beasts or animals, as well as it talks about the plants. So therefore, Lawrence's concern shifted to the natural world, and he had composed that particular collection, birds, beasts, and flowers. But here, one thing is important to remember that the collection, birds, beasts, and flowers, there are various sections in this particular collection, and the title of the sections are very interesting. Like, he has given the title of the section heading is fruits, and the name of the poems are like pomegranate, fig, apple. Again, he has given the name of another section as trees, flowers, birds, insects, and reptiles. From the reptile section, our present poem, Snake, and we will talk about this poem in a moment. Now, I'll be very briefly talking about the biographical account, the particular moment, the particular context in which this particular volume of poem, Birds, Beasts, and Flowers, had been written. As Anindoda has mentioned that this is a modern poem and D.H. Lawrence is a modern poet. So it was around the First World War when Lawrence, along with his wife Freda, they had been expelled from their home on the suspicion of being a German spy. Lawrence was thought to be a German spy. Why? Because his wife Freda had a German lineage. And at that time, there was an antagonism going on between the two countries, the Axis powers and the Allied forces. So both were opponent to each other. And therefore, there was a kind of acrimony growing against those Europeans who were non-Germans, okay? So who are Germans? Now, as Freda was German, she had a German lineage. So Lawrence and Freda was thought to be the German spy, and on this accusation, they have been expelled from their homeland. And at that time, they were just moving all over the world for the next decade. They went to the various parts of Europe, and ultimately they went to Sicily as well. They went to Italy, the province in Italy, it's Sicily, and later on they also went to America and composed few poems. So the whole collection of Birds and Beasts and Flowers, all the sections have been composed in installments in different parts of Europe as well as few parts of Asia, and then the collection Birds, Beasts and Flowers came into existence. Now what happened? However, for D.H. Lawrence, these rootless years would fuel a new chapter in his philosophical thoughts and writing. His philosophies on nature and on man's external and internal balance. These two words are very important. First of all, his focus or philosophy on nature, and from nature, the human beings' external and internal balance. Internal balance within the human being and external balance within human being or between human beings and nature. So his philosophies on nature as well as man's external and internal balance within nature gained a new popularity at this time. He shifted his focus onto nature and the balance within human beings and outside human beings with nature. So that was the actually at the core theme of his poems, or particularly at the backdrop of Birds, Beasts and Flowers. Now, Freda Lawrence, Lawrence's wife, she had written one book. The name of the book is Not I, But the Wind. Not I, But the Wind. And in that particular book, Freda said that living in Sicily after the war years was like coming to life again. So they moved to Italy, Sicily, and at this at that particular place in Sicily, in Italy, the poem Snake was composed. I'll be coming to that point, but before that, what I'm trying to suggest is that Freda, in her book Not I But the Wind, she said that living in Sicily after the war years was like coming to life again. So from the war-torn Europe to going to Italy and living there and being with nature gave altogether a different philosophical outlook to Lawrence. And then, living in the shadow of smoking Etna, as he compared, the term shadow of smoking Etna is a phrase that is included in the poem Snake. I'll be coming to that point later on. But, living in Sicily, Lawrence began to absorb the natural beauty around him. And he turned his thoughts from frustration with the warring humanity in Europe to a contemplation of nature. He became fascinated with the creative destructive dualism in nature. This is very important. He became fascinated with the creative destructive dualism in nature. When he looked at nature, he philosophizes nature in its twin aspects. And what are the twin aspects? What are the dual aspects? The dualism of creative and destructive principles in nature. Nature is creative, it creates, it nurtures human being, as well as it destructs, it annihilates, it kills. So nature has both the aspect, quite strikingly opposite to each other. One is the creative aspect, another one is the destructive aspect. Nature is combined, or with this binary opposition, having this binary principle within nature. One aspect of nature creates, another aspect of nature destructs or devastates or destructs. So therefore nature is capable of having both the binary impulses within it. So Lawrence, from the understanding of nature, moved to human beings, and he tried to philosophize that if nature is capable of having the twin aspect within it, why can't the human beings? I mean, to make it more simple, he is trying to suggest that if nature can have the two opposite aspects, and what are the two opposite aspects? The aspect of a creator, nature creates, nature sustains, as well as it has the aspect of destructive properties. It can kill, it can annihilate, it can devastate. So nature has the potential existence, the binary existence of both these opposite things. One is the creative impulse, another one is the destructive impulse. And nature is capable of maintaining a balance between this creative and the destructive properties. So from that particular understanding of nature, of having equipped with the creative and the destructive properties in nature, he went to the understanding of human beings, and he said that if nature is capable of balancing, of maintaining the balance between the creative and the destructive aspect of aspect, then why can't the human beings? Human beings also need to balance the creative and the destructive, the two striking opposite features within the human beings. So that is what Lawrence's philosophy is. He said that he became fascinated with the creative destructive duality of nature, and he began to consider this in the human psyche. He said that if nature was able to maintain a certain balance and harmony between the creation and the destruction, why couldn't the human beings? Lawrence then began to formulate his own philosophy of a balanced soul. And that philosophy of balanced soul is different from that of Plato. Now, he felt that, and he said that one must acknowledge as important both the good and the uglier aspects of the human being. So he said that one must acknowledge, one must accept as important both the good and the uglier sides of the natural world, and as well as the human soul. So he is advocating here that the human beings must accept the binary opposites in nature, as well as human beings must acknowledge that we are good, we are evil. We have the positive side, we have the negative side. We have the positive vibrancy within ourselves. We also again is drawn by sexual drives. We have the criminal instincts, we become violent. So all these negative aspects are also within human being. He is not moralizing, he is not philosophizing that it is the good aspect of the human being that needs to prevail. This is what all the philosophical books or the moral philosophy or the religious philosophy often proclaims. They said that a human being must always strive to become good, to become better in life. But Lawrence does not deny the opposite aspect of the human being, the negative aspect of the human being. He said that it is true, and human beings must acknowledge both the sides, the good and the uglier sides within himself, and they should attempt, they should strive to make a balance within them, combining these two opposite sides. They have the positive or the good side, they have the uglier sides, uglier selves. What human beings try to strive is to make a kind of compatible balance between these two opposite sides. This is what the human beings must do according to, or in the opinion of D.H. Lawrence. He said that human beings must, acknowledge and balance these two opposite sides, and if they do so, they can only lead the balanced life by allowing the all the parts of nature, or all the parts of the human being, human self, one could find the external as well as the internal harmony within the human beings. So this is what Lawrence's philosophy is. And then I'll be referring to one essay by D.H. Lawrence, and the name of the essay, and interesting, the title of my talk, that individual consciousness versus the social consciousness. This is basically the name of one essay written by D.H. Lawrence. Now, in his essay, the individual consciousness versus the natural social consciousness, Lawrence mentions that the individual consciousness is what? What is individual consciousness? He mentions that individual consciousness is that part of ourselves which separates, which differentiates between or among the human beings as well as among the natural world. I will explain that particular thing. In his essay, The Individual Consciousness versus the Social Consciousness, he said that individual consciousness is the it is that part of the human being which does not separate, which does not differentiate between the or among the human beings or with the nature. And this nature also includes the animals, not only the plants but also the animals. So the individual consciousness, simply explaining, individual consciousness is something which does not separate. Individual consciousness is something that comes inborn, that comes from heart, that comes from emotional, that comes from sensation, and that individual consciousness does not differentiate. It does not create boundary between the humans and the humans. It is not the victim of religion. It is not the victim of the boundary of caste, creed, religion, culture. It unites, it combines, and it does not only combines and unites the human beings. Rather, this individual consciousness also includes the others, whom we conventionally call the other. That is the nature, the animals, the plants, the birds, the beasts. Individual consciousness advocates, or it takes each and every human and non-human organism to be its own. So this is what the individual consciousness is. Individual consciousness is instinctive. It comes from the heart, it comes from the emotion, and it includes everything. It believes in oneness, it believes in the coexistence, it believes in the cohabitation of the humans, non-humans, the animals, the plants, each and everything. This is what the individual consciousness is. But the social consciousness, as per Lawrence's argument goes, he said that this social consciousness is not instinctive. It does not come spontaneously from the heart. Rather, this social consciousness is the result of traditional education. The kind of teachings, the social teachings, the education that we learn in the institutions, which teaches us that we are the civilized. We are not like the animals. Animals are, barbars. Human beings, the nomadic people are the barbars. The indigenous are the barbars. They do not have any moral right. So since we are educated, we are the privileged one. We have the power through education. We have knowledge, and knowledge creates power. As you know, that Foucault says that knowledge is power. So, through the education, through the social convention, we become socially conscious, and this social consciousness, which is the product of the traditional education system, makes us selfish. We then separates between one human group, another human group, between one human being, another human being, between the human beings and the animals, between the human beings and the nature or the plants. So individual consciousness is something that is opposite to social consciousness. Social consciousness, which is the product of intellect, which is the product of knowledge, which does not come instinctively from our heart. It is the product of the intellect or the reason or the knowledge or the logic. And then this social consciousness teaches human being to separate, teaches human being to, differentiate. And he is against this social consciousness. He basically, we always, privileges this social consciousness. When you go to certain place, you always, try to fit in the social dictates. If society has created a framework, then you are supposed to fit in that framework. You cannot express, to give you one example here, I need to say that society has various strictures, like for example, for the women, in feminist studies or in gender studies, traditionally the role of the women has been given that they are subservient to the men, and they are only capable of childbirth, and they can only maintain the household duties. So these were the traditional duties that were given to the women, so long. Now, these are the social dictates. A woman was supposed, and from the ancient culture onwards, woman was thought to fit into that particular societal framework. This is what generally happened in the human history. So therefore, the social consciousness is something which actually creates a framework, and you are supposed to follow that framework. Like, this dictates of patriarchy also said that you cannot cry. The men, men are the macho beings, they have the macho virility, they have the macho masculinity, and this always, restricts men from crying. They cannot cry, they cannot weep. Weeping is something that is traditionally associated with the women, with the girls and the ladies. So society has a structure. And even if as a male, even if as a man, you try to cry, or you fail to cry, you think the necessity of cry, or you cry, immediately you will find that, oh, I am a man, why should I weep? Weeping is something that is traditionally associated with the women. So these are the strictures, these are the products of the social consciousness, that if you are a man, you cannot cry, you cannot weep, as though weeping is something that is associated with the human being. So this is what is the social consciousness. Society has created a framework, and human beings are supposed to follow that. Now, Lawrence is actually championing or advocating the first one, that is the individual consciousness. So this is what is the binary or the comparison between the individual consciousness and the social consciousness. Now, the social consciousness is that which comes with education, and it has its emphasis on intellect. It sees separatedness from each other and within ourselves from nature, and the social consciousness is unable to bridge the two halves into a united whole. It cannot bridge the two halves, the opposites, into a united whole where the individual consciousness can. Now, if it cannot bridge the two halves into an united whole, so how do we bridge the gap within ourselves? What is Lawrence's recipe for reconciling ourselves with nature? How can we, reconcile? How can we, mix up, or we can draw ourselves towards nature? How can we do that? And he gives the answer then in another essay, that is the psychoanalysis and the unconscious. Psychoanalysis and unconscious is the name of another essay written by D.H. Lawrence. And in that particular essay, Lawrence calls for an awareness of the body and the unconscious. So, how to bridge the gap between the two extreme poles, between the individual consciousness and the social consciousness? Lawrence said that both are important. And since most of the students are from Bihar, मतलब मैं जो बोलना चाहता हूँ हिंदी में थोड़ा बोल दे रहा हूँ कि यहाँ पर लॉरेंस किसी एक सिस्टम ऑफ थॉट को मतलब ले नहीं रहे हैं, वो उनको मतलब ही इज नॉट एप्रिसिएटिंग और एडवोकेटिंग एनी वन सिस्टम ऑफ बिलीफ कि इंडिविजुअल कॉन्शियसनेस अच्छा है या फिर सोशल कॉन्शियसनेस अच्छा है। लॉरेंस ऐसे फिलोसोफाइज या फिर मोरलाइज नहीं कर रहे हैं, ही इज एक्चुअली सेइंग दैट बोथ आर इंपॉर्टेंट। इंसान के अंदर ये ऑपोजिट्स रहेंगे, एक ओर से वो इंडिविजुअल कॉन्शियसनेस रहेगा और एक ओर से सोशल कॉन्शियसनेस रहेगा। आप किसी एक को छोड़ नहीं सकते, बोथ आर इंपॉर्टेंट। लेकिन ये दोनों को मैं कैसे बैलेंस कर सकता हूं अपने अंदर, उसके आंसर में, उसके उत्तर के स्वरूप लॉरेंस बता रहे हैं उनके नेक्स्ट ऐसे में, साइको एनालिसिस एंड अनकॉन्शियस। ही सेड दैट how to reconcile the opposites. He said that he and Lawrence calls for a new awareness of the body and the unconscious, that we need to be aware of the body and the unconscious. Now this is something new during the modern age, particularly when Lawrence was writing beforehand. हम लोग जब मेटाफिजिकल जॉन डन और सारे भी मेटाफिजिकल पोइट्स थे, उनके वहां पर हम लोग मेटाफिजिकल पोइट्री जब पढ़ रहे थे, so we know that they were actually talking about the body and all these things, but Lawrence यहाँ पर मॉडर्न पोएम पे बोल रहे हैं that body is important. We always crave for soul, that how to purify our soul, how to make our soul better, how we can become better human beings. So these are all philosophical questions, you know, that human beings should strive to make their selves better, to make their soul better. But nobody has talked about the body. That body is also an important part. That body has its own desire. That body has its own appetite. That sexuality is something that should not be repressed, or rather it should be celebrated. It should be, you know, listened to. Body has its own calls. Body has its own appetites. Body has its own calls, its own, you know, clamors, and it should not be repressed. It should not be objected. It should not be banned. It is what traditionally had been going on. But Lawrence, for the first time, he said that how we can balance the two opposites, we can do that if we listen to the voice or the call of the body and the unconscious. So listening to the body and the unconscious is very important for Lawrence. And Lawrence said that body has a natural wisdom, you know, body has a natural wisdom, and instincts means what comes spontaneously, you know. I had a mood to dance, I have a mood to dance. So this is something which is very instinctive. Freud said id, this part id. Okay, I'll come to Freudian psychology or the Freudian reading of this poem, but you know, instincts. So instincts is something that should be listened to. Instincts should not be repressed. It should be listened to. And he calls this instinct, this instinctual part of the human beings, the quote unquote blood self. So he calls this instinctive part of the human beings the blood self. So this blood self is very important when we talk about Lawrence's poetry or Lawrence's philosophical understanding. Now, this blood self, you know, human education is always afraid of this instinct, is always afraid of this spontaneous feelings. We have been, you know, trained, we have been educated, we have been socialized to trust the intellect, not the blood self. Lawrence felt that we need to allow our blood self, our instincts to guide us. And if we can do that, we can make the possible bridge with the other, with the nature, with animals, with planets. If we allow our instincts to champion ourselves, if we allow our instincts to guide our life, then and then only we can make a harmony and the balance within the human beings as well as with nature. So there can be internal balance within the human being as well as the external balance with the nature, if on the condition that if we let instincts to predominate our actions, if we let our blood self to champion our action, then and then only we can make the possible balance and harmony within human being as well as with nature. So this is what at the backdrop of Lawrence's philosophy. And then I will directly directly go to the discussion of the poem. All these philosophies actually reach a peak in Lawrence's present poem, The Snake. The Snake actually culminates all these philosophies that I have talked so far in psychoanalysis and unconscious, in the individual consciousnesses, the social consciousness. So all these philosophies have reached its peak in a poem, short poem, Snake. Now, but we can read the Snake very casually. I mean, this is a poem that is included in, CBSE, ICSE syllabus of class 10, 7, 8, in India, even in various syllabuses of the central boards. That poem is included in class 8 syllabus, class 10 syllabus, as well as in plus 2 or 12 syllabus. And this is also included in, in KKM College Jamui. It is included in UG syllabus. For our Vidyasagar University, it is included in post graduation. Now, this is a very interesting poem. Why? Because all these philosophies that I have talked about, it cannot be shared, it cannot be understood, or it cannot be, taught at a college, school student, with a school student. But as you are the sensitive, listener, or the serious reader, we must understand it with the backdrop of all those philosophies that I have talked so far. But apparently, without all these philosophies, we can understand the poem at a narrative level. The poem says a very simple story. It has a storyline, it has a narrative line. And, if we look at the summary of the poem, this is very simple. What is it? It talks about an encounter, a meeting between a snake and the poet. So the poem actually talks about an encounter or meeting between a human being and an animal, that is the snake. Okay. And what is at the summary or the storyline? A man, or the poetic persona here, on a very hot day in Sicily, in Italy, on a very hot day in Sicily or Italy, both of them, the man as well as the snake, they went to a trough. Trough is a receptacle where the water is, stored for the cattle to drink and eat. So trough, it is called trough. So, water trough. Now, it was a very hot day in Sicily, and the poet and the snake, both of them felt thirsty, and they went to a water trough to fetch water. So the poet was going with his pitcher, with his container, with his jug to fetch the water. But the moment he went there, he had seen that a snake is already drinking the water from the water trough. And then what he will do? Normally, any ordinary human being like you and me, we will just, take something and, throw at the snake, and then the snake will go away. So this is what generally the normal human beings do. But the poet does not do that purposefully, definitely. And he is waiting that when the turn of the snake will be over, when the drinking water, when the drink when the thirst of the snake will be quenched, and then only he would go and take his water. So he waits for it, and then suddenly he has a lot of thought in his mind that he generally, the human education that we are talking about at the social consciousness, it came to his mind, and he thought that, should I kill the snake? The voice of my education said that it must be killed. So, and he was very, in a conflict. On the one hand, he had an admiration and fascination for the snake, but on the other hand, his education, his conscience, the intellect, the kind of traditional education that he had taken so long, it tells him to kill the snake. And he was torn apart between the two opposite emotions, that whether should I kill it, whether should I throw it, or whether should I listen to my instinct and not to kill it. His instinctive self, his individual self said that he's very fascinated with the snake. He's very enamored with the beauty of the snake, and his instinctive self is not ready to kill that snake, because the snake at that moment is harmless. I mean, it is not coming to bite the human being, the poetic persona, so it is harmless. But on the other hand, the social consciousness, the concept of masculinity, the macho masculinity that I was talking about, the mirth patriarchal attitude that is within human being, it said that if you are a man, you must kill it. So it challenges the masculinity of the human being, that if you are a man, you cannot become fearful, you cannot become fearful to the snake, you must immediately take something and kill the snake. Not that it is harmful, rather to prove the masculinity of the human being. So that is what is the product of the human education. And all on a sudden, he becomes hypnotized. He was hypnotized for the first time from the beginning by looking at the beauty of the snake, and then immediately the voice of his education prevails over him, captures his mind, and he immediately took a clumsy log and throw it at the snake. Although the snake does not get any hurt, but went. It went into its fissure and it left. And then the poet is making a kind of a regret, he's regretting that it was not a good thing that he has done, and he become remorseful. He was ashamed at what he has already done. And then the poem ends with a desire that he needs to expiate, he needs to atone for it, he needs to atone for the sin that he has done, committed to the human being. So both the voices is within him, and the poem ends with it. So I'll just read a few lines from the poem. It's not possible to read the whole poem. It would have been better if I could do that with you, but it's not possible. But I'll just very briefly talk about the few sections of this poem, and then you will understand the whole thing that I have talked so far. How the poem starts, it starts very casually. It starts by saying, a snake came to my water trough on a hot day, and I in pajamas for the heat to drink there. A snake came to my water trough on a hot day, and I in pajamas for the heat to drink there. So it's a very simple beginning. Two strangers, the poetic persona and the snake, two strangers are drawn by a common need for water on an intensely hot day in Sicily. And suddenly and unexpectedly, two different species, one is reptile, another one is a human being, Homo sapiens. Both the different beings, one is reptile, that is the snake, another one belongs to the larger plethora of Homo sapiens. Both the species meet one another, and then what happened? Both of them went to quench their thirst by having water, by drinking water. But the way of quenching the thirst is strikingly opposite, different from one another. The snake, simply went there and it is drinking directly from it. But the poet is taking a pitcher with him, I will come to later on to that. He's carrying is carrying a container, and he will fetch the water from that water trough, and he would take that water in his home, in his house. So the human beings, the Homo sapiens, are using technology for it, technology to quench his thirst, where the snake does not care for this technology and all these things. We human beings are also one species of animals. Although we are the superior beings, although we have an very advanced being, but we also have the same kind of feeling. We are also human. We are also one species. Although we have the ability to speak, although we have the ability to think in a superior position in comparison to the other animals, but we are also animal. Aristotle also said that man is a political animal. So we are also an animal, but we are an advanced animal. We are superior animal, and this is what each and every religion also propagates, from Gita to Quran to Bible. Each and everything that in Quran it is called Asraful means better creation. Human beings are the better creation of God, but it is also creation, and the snake is in its primordial form, in its original form, but the human beings have become advanced. It carries a pitcher to fetch the water. It will not drink by touching its mouth in the water throw and drink it directly from there. Rather, human beings have become advanced, although whatever. But there one thing needs to be mentioned, that the moment we just listen to the title snake, somewhere it has the resonance of the biblical snake. You remember that in the Garden of Eden there had been a peaceful existence. It was in a prelapsarian stage, and Satan had taken the shape of snake or serpent, and it went to tempt Eve. It ear poisoned Eve, and then Eve was propelled to eat the forbidden fruit, and then Adam also eat it, and both of them expelled from the Garden of Eden. They came to this earth, and then human beings have their misery. So this is what happened in the Bible. The Bible always criminalizes snake, as though snake is something that is abhorring, that is detestable. It is not an animal. It is something that is to be detested, that is to be hated. And how it becomes a source of loathing or hatred from the myth of Christianity, from the myth of the Bible. How Bible mentions it, if you read Bible in chapter 3, in the book of Genesis, in chapter 3, verse number 14, God said to serpent or the snake, because you have done this, quote unquote, I am quoting, because you have done this, means the snake has done this, the snake has tempted Eve and Adam. Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and wild animals. So you are cursed above all the animals, above all the wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and you will eat the dust all the days of your life. You will crawl on your belly and you will eat the dust all days of your life. So this is what the biblical symbolism or biblical description of the snake, that a snake is cursed because of tempting Eve. Now, Lawrence is actually inverting that particular biblical myth. He said that no, a snake is not responsible for that. Rather, the human education, the human conscience is responsible for that. He is not blaming a snake, because it is very easy to stereotype something or someone, and it is very easy to criminalize that particular being, and from that it is very normal to violate, to inflict violence on it. Time is very short, so I won't have that opportunity to explain all these things, but you listen that when we otherize someone, why we otherize something or someone? We otherize someone because to have a power, because to have the dominance, and how to have that dominance through the violence. So violence is very important in order to make something or someone other. So here snake has been criminalized, it has been cursed, and it had been the traditional association. What Lawrence is doing, he, as though he was standing at a particular moment when the fall or the temptation has not happened at all, and he's looking at the prelapsarian stage of the human beings, when the animals, the plants, the human beings, all of them were in mutual existence. So he's talking about that particular prelapsarian stage where there had not been any bitterness, there had not been any acrimony, there had not been any separatedness or difference between the human beings and the animals. At that time, each and every animal, each and every human beings, they were living perfectly in the Garden of Eden. Lawrence went to that, and Lawrence again does not, he is inverting that biblical myth of snake. He again is going to the Eastern myth, the pagan myth, which does not violate the dignity of the snake. Rather, if we go to read the pagan myths of snake, we'll find that a snake is celebrated as a vital force of life. So a snake is not something that has been criminalized as it has been done in the biblical myth of the Genesis, of the temptation and the fall of the human beings. Rather, if we go to the pagan myths, we'll find that snake is something that has been celebrated. So a snake was the vital source of life. It was the instinct. It was the creation of all the beings. So therefore, a snake was revered, respected in the paganic myth. So Lawrence went to that paganic myth. Why I'm saying all these things? It has the reference in the text itself. When after a few stanzas, when he talks about Etna volcano, and he later on compares the snake with that of a god. Towards the end of the poem, he compares the snake with that of a god with small g. Now, small god is something that is traditionally associated with the pagan culture, okay, not the Christian culture. In Christian culture, God comes with the capital G, but in the pagan myth, we always find God with the small g, and therefore he compares snake with that of a small god with with small g. So therefore, Lawrence went to the paganic myth when snake was celebrated, when there had been a perfect reference. Even in Monosa Mongol and all these things in Indian culture, a snake has always been revered, respected. We always find various folk performances which celebrates the snakes, different folk performances in India, in the tribal, in the village area till now. So therefore, he went to that pagan myth which celebrates snake, not criminalizes snake. And then he again, in the second stanza, he interestingly said, I'm reading out the second stanza. In the second stanza, he's saying, in the deep, strange-scented shade of the great dark carob tree, I came down the steps with my pitcher, importantly, and must wait, for there he was at the trough before me. So Lawrence is saying, I must wait. Why? Because there he was before me. Who? Animal, snake. An animal is always greeted as it, but Lawrence is taking the poetic persona here is taking the animal as an equal with the human being, and therefore it is not saying it, rather it is saying I must wait. Why? Because he was there before me. So he is actually championing or advocating the oneness of the animals and the humans, the human and the non-human species. And therefore, he is greeting the snake with he. And he said to himself that I must wait because there is already one person, there is already one species that is drinking. So I, as a gentle human being, must wait until my turn came. And then, so all the scientific philosophies, all the scientific competition of the Victorian period, you are remember of Darwin's competition, Darwin's theory of competition, his theory of the survival for the fittest, struggle for existence. All this has been broken or collapsed in this particular poem. Here, there is not a kind of survival for the fittest, struggle for existence with the human and the non-human. Rather, there is a oneness. There is a mutual compatibility, symbiosis within the nature of the human and the non-human. And then, in the third stanza, the poet describes the movement of the snake, and it says, now the form of the poem is also important. If you read the third stanza, the lines like, he reached down from a fissure in the earth wall in the gloom and trailed his yellow brown slackness, soft bellied sound, and rested the throat upon, etc., etc. Why I'm saying all these things? Because there is an alliteration of S sound. There is an alliteration of S sound, and this S sound mimics the hissing sound of the snake. The sound of the snake is called hissing, and like this, the words, the alliteration is also mimicking the sound of the snake. Not only the alliteration, but if you just look at the typographical line of the poem, you will see that very long elongated line, the long lines, which also represents the visual image of the snake. So not only in content, but in form, he also made true experiment. He is the lines, the sounds, the alliteration, everything is mimicking the movement of the sound. This is an interesting formal approach on the part of Lawrence in this poem. And then, uh, again, in the fourth stanza, the same argument also goes, and he said that someone was before me at my water trough, and I, like a second comer, must wait. So the same thing goes on, that he must wait. But in the subsequent stanza, he gives a very picturesque description of the snake's movement, and he said that he lifted his head off from his drinking. So he is actually describing the movement of the snake, and he said that he lifted his head from his drinking as cattle do and looked at me vaguely. So the snake was drinking, and at that time the snake looked at, while he was drinking, it looked at the poetic persona vaguely. Now this is very important. The snake looked at the person vaguely, as though it does not care, as though it is different. A snake does not have any emotional approach like you and me, and therefore it does not care that who is there. It does not care at all. It can care only on the condition that it is fearful that human beings do any harm, and apart from it, it does not care. It believes in the indifference. But why the particular point looked at me vaguely? Why the snake looked at him vaguely? The famous philosopher Derrida made a very post-human and eco-critical reading of this poem, snake. And he is also, advocate of animal philosophy. And in one of his essays, the name of the essay is "The Animal That Therefore I Am." The animal that therefore I am. In that particular essay, he talks about animal philosophy. Now, Derrida's eco-critical and Derrida's post-human reading of this poem suggests that in this particular line where it said that vaguely looking of the snake towards the poet, it is actually, Derrida said, is the result of animal's gauge. Animal is, animal has a gauge. Like in feminist gauge, Laura Mulvey, the feminist critic, she said of the male gauge, the way the women's bodies have been projected in the camera in Bollywood and other movies, these are the male gauge. We look at the a woman's body. Likewise, the snake has also a gauge, and that animal gauge is drawn towards the human being. And why there is a gauge of the animal towards the human being? Because it needs a changing animal status in culture. That animal needs to have a changing perception. That animal is not something that is subservient, that it is not different from the human beings. Rather, we must believe in the oneness of the human being with the animals, and therefore that animal gauge is drawn towards the human being. This is what Derrida's reading of the poem Snake is. Again, it talks about, Etna. In the last line of this particular stanza, where it says that on the day of Sicilian July with Etna smoking. This Etna is again very important. We know that Etna is a name of a volcano in Sicily. Now, Etna is an active volcano, but it remains dormant for that time. But it could erupt at any moment. And this Etna is what? It is the human beings, We also have that dormant emotions within ourselves. We always repress our instincts, We always repress our instincts. But that instinct can come out at any moment. Freud also said that return of the repressed. We may repress our id, we may repress our spontaneous instinctive feeling, but it will come in different form maybe, but it will come. So you cannot repress the id, return of the repressed. Okay, So Etna is symbolic of that return of the repressed again. Now I can see that time, I have only 1 minute, so I'll take only 1 minute and I'll come to one point what I was saying. Suddenly he said that the voice of my education said to me that it must be killed. And he goes on to describe this. The voice of his education said to him that it must be killed. The snake must be killed. And here I will just tell you one reference, and with this I will conclude the reading of the poem. Uh, Here we may find the psychoanalysis reading of this poem, when it said that the voice of my education, the voice of my accursed education said to me that the snake must be killed. Why the snake must be killed? Because the voice of my education told it to me. Now, what is that voice of education? Uh, there was one critic, Kate Sagar, she said that we can find Freudian analysis here. Freud said that id is something that is spontaneous, and human education or society is the super ego, and ego is something that mediates between the two. Okay, now his oneself, his id is actually, very overwhelmed with the fascination or the beauty of the snake, but the super ego, the education, said that it must be killed. The other appears as a possible threat to the self, and then as the other appears as a possible threat to the self, it must be killed. And therefore he took a clumsy log and threw at it. But again, I will end with the thing that I have already talked, that he is not telling which one is important, which one is not, but the so long people generally degraded the instinctive self, they criminalizes the instinctive self, they always degraded the lower self. But Lawrence said that no, it should not be degraded, it should not be disregarded. Rather, the blood self, the instinctive self, is also to be listened to. And he's not moralizing anything. Rather, he said that this societal self as well as this individual self must combine, and it should remain in perfect balance and harmony within the human beings. And when it is possible, it can only be possible when human beings can listen to the unconscious, to the body. Then and then only it can be possible. Thank you so much. I have a lot of other things to tell, but because of the time, I cannot complete it. Okay, if you have any question, you may ask me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mir. It was an extremely well-framed lecture. You have brilliantly introduced the concept of eco-consciousness with examples from our life and also from literature. You have talked about Lawrence's contribution as a poet. You have talked about the significance of the book, Birds, Beasts, and the Flowers. You have also mentioned the philosophy of Lawrence behind writing this book. And altogether, you have created a very pertinent background for the poem. You really handled it so well. The poem is also very well explained, I must say. The binary of creation and destruction in nature and how nature balances between the two is very well argued in the course of your talk. And you have also mentioned Lawrence's essay regarding individual consciousness and social consciousness and connected it in the context of this poem. And you have also exhaustively analyzed the poem from all possible aspects, I must say, and perhaps covered everything related to it. I really thank you for that. And I am also very glad that you have also mentioned certain important and complex part of your talk in Hindi for the benefits of the students from Bihar. I'm sure it was really helpful to them.
Thank you.
So, uh, with your permission, let us move to the question answer session. We'll take 5 or 6 questions. Okay, the questions will be on your screen.
Derrida analyzes this poem under the burden of Levinas's uncomfortable hesitation to grant animals a face, and therefore to make humans ethically responsible towards them. What is your take on this? When we talk about Levinas, Levinas has a different approach altogether. I mean, Levinas, if we go to Levinas, at one point of time, he said that violence is something that he talked about, that one person needs to use violence to subjugate the other. So that is what he said. And it is also, comes from the Leviathan philosophy as well. So let me Derrida analyzes this poem under the burden of Levinas's uncomfortable hesitation to grant animal a face and therefore to make humans ethically responsible towards them. I don't understand the part of the question. Like, if you can elaborate the question, then I'll be. I mean, if you can explain that what is you are trying to, ask, then it would be possible for me to give the answer. Okay, if you can ask me the question in a better way, then I'll understand. I'll give the answer. But next question: do you think that Lawrence neutrally and objectively described snake to convey maybe inner conflict between the poet I, self, and the superego? Here, one important thing. Yes. On the screen. Okay. Do you think Lawrence neutrally and objectively described snake to convey inner conflict? Describe snake to convey inner conflict between the poet, I, self, and the superego. Yeah, definitely. It's his. I mean, here he has a different stance altogether. He's a different take altogether. I mean, this subjectivity, all these things also has been mentioned by other writers. Like, I can talk about the romantic poets who also talk about this subjective I, self, etc. But their perception is totally different from that of Lawrence's. Supposed to give you one example. P.B. Shelley, in his To a Sky, like he said that, hail to the blithe spirit, bar thou never art, etc., etc. Now there, the subjective emotion of the poet has been given, but here he remains objective in a sense that he creates a persona. He creates a persona, and he is not into the binaries. Rather, he is ready to take each and every aspect of the human being. So from this perspective, he is, he is in a position to make a possible, bridge with I, self, and superego and everything. So this is what I have been telling so far. Do you consider Lawrence as one of the precursor of Lawrence's studies? What kind of speciesism, one of the central concerns of animal studies, did Lawrence seem to have brought to the snake? I have already mentioned that one is from reptile and another one is from, yes, we can take it definitely as the precursor. This is what, he has also been regarded as a precursor, although his poem, particularly The Snake, has been analyzed from this particular angle of animal studies. And yes, we can take him as a precursor, particularly his understanding of nature, his understanding of animals. And yeah, they are the two species. I said that one is a reptile, another the Homo sapiens, and then both of them can have a possible coexistence or cohabitation. That is what he was telling so far.
Mir, my colleague Safi has a question.
Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
I listened to your lecture. It was very interesting, and it just brought to my mind a short story. I don't know if you are aware of it. Kushwant Singh's The Mark of Vishnu. The Mark of Vishnu by Kushwant Singh. Are you aware? Have you read this story? It's a story about.
No, I have not read this.
Okay, so in short, what that story has is that it's about the Indian practice of worshipping the snake, and so there is an old man who reveres the snake, and then there are some young boys, who want to kill it, and near the end, those boys manage to kill the snake, or rather badly wound the snake, and at that point, that older person, because of his reverence, he comes to offer milk to the badly wounded snake, and the snake bites him, and presumably he dies because the bite is fatal. Now, the reason that I bring this up is because there is a certain, one can say that Kushwant Singh's reading of the reverence of the snake uh, is will be is positioned after the snake of D.H. Lawrence, in the sense that Lawrence talks about reverence, and Singh then goes onward and talks about the effects of that reverence, what follows after. Does the nature of the snake change if you revere it? Is the snake inherently a being that is different from how it is perceived, or does it still remain an animal and one that is not really, that is indifferent to whether or what kind of reverence that you show to it or you do not show to it? So, if we read this D.H. Lawrence's The Snake in the light of that particular interpretation of the creature, the snake, and that particular interpretation of the reverence that is shown to the snake, then it would almost seem, and in fact, Lawrence seems to be aware of that, because in the snake there are two voices talking simultaneously. One is his rational mind that keeps telling him that, you should kill it, and one is his other mind that tells him that no, it is something of a, it's an uncrowned king, and where his sort of fantasy takes over, and there is a sort of a conflict between those two sides, and in the end, it's almost as if that other side wins over his rational part. But what the rational part is saying is actually true. The snake is after all a snake, and it is after all poisonous. So, So in that light, shouldn't we ask the question whether the kind of reverence, the kind of respect that Lawrence shows towards the snake, even as it tries to change the meaning of the snake in its symbolic form, it complicates the reality of the snake, and perhaps leads to a position where what the snake is can be misinterpreted in reality, as it is often the case. What is your take on that?
My take on it is that, he is not, thank you first of all for giving me the reference from Kushwant Singh's short story, but he is not, I have already given a hint of this particular thing, that he is not actually advocating any one principal belief, whether it is a rational mind. It is not only the two voices. For the shortage of time, I have already told about the two voices, but we can see polyphony. There are various voices. We cannot only understand ourselves in terms of the binary, that either or neither nor. We are an amalgamation of various voices, and which one wins at what point of time, it's a very complex mechanism. So therefore, he is not actually giving any one kind of belief. Rather, he said that it is true. He throws a clumsy log, so it is possibly a threat to the human beings, everything. But he is also having an admiration towards it. I think it's pretty normal. Rather, he's not romanticizing here. Rather, he's giving a very real self, that we human beings, one part of our mind fears it, but another part of our mind admires it. We look at the beauty. And personally, I'm a very huge fan, of snake, particularly when I took my interest during my undergraduate. The first thing that I Googled in was the various kinds of snakes, colubridis, vibridis, and then the various kinds of snakes. So I had an admiration for it, but since I have a fascination for it, I won't go and just touch the temperament of that snake. I won't do that. So yes, it is not to be seen in a binary. Rather, there are various kinds of voices, various kinds of understanding. One part is, so therefore he is not actually concretizing any one belief. This is my understanding of the poem.
So you do not believe that he is romanticizing the...
He's romanticizing, definitely, because the kind of paradisical, the character, all the associations that has been given, definitely he's romanticizing, but not romanticizing as the romantics has done. The romantics, I'm giving you a very short example.
But he does mention the albatross.
I'm saying here, sir, when he said that, in Poor Skylar, when Sally is saying that, "Hail to the blithe spirit, but thou never art." You are not a bird. You are something that is, this is what is called pure romanticism. But he takes the snake as a snake. It does not take it as something else, etc., etc. So yes, albatross has a different significance altogether. It is for penance, it is to expatiate. So it is in this context that the reference of the albatross has been incorporated. This is my understanding of the poem.
Thank you very much. I mean,
Thank
it's
you.
Thank you so much, Mir, for your engrossing talk and the beautiful questions session. Now,
Thank you.
let us move towards to the next speaker. Uh,
Thank you. So I'm
so I
leaving the
request my
student.
colleagues. Yeah, sure, sure.
Okay,
So
thank you.
I
Thank you once
request.
again, Anindoda and Danish Bhai, for organizing such a beautiful program, for taking such a good initiative for the students. I'm very thankful, and let me share with you that some of my students have also attended this talk. So it's an enlightening one. It's had been a great experience with you all. Thank you.
thank you
Thank
for
you.
taking the time to join us today. Thank you very much, Mir.
So over to you, sir.
Okay, thanks, Anindya. We have a very interesting talk coming up next. We have with us Dr. Sana Fatima. She works as an academic associate in the Indian Institute of Management at Kashipur. She's currently working on an ICSSR project as a senior researcher. And I would love it if she would explain a little bit about this work, because it seems very interesting. Converging witch hunting cases in India. She has been awarded her PhD in English from Aligarh Muslim University, and her research was, the title of her thesis was "Color Aesthetics: A Study of Cross-Cultural Matrix in Select Indian Fiction and its Intermediate Translation." A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Fatima, and over to you.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible?
Audible. You are audible. You are audible.
Okay, sir. Good morning, everyone. And okay, since I've been introduced in terms of my research project that I have undertaken at IIM Kashipur, I'm working on a ICSSR sponsored project on cases of witch hunting in India, and most of us are familiar with the take on that. Like recently released film Bulbul, and so many films have been made on witch. Like how do you brand a woman as a witch and then people kill? So it's very common practice, and reportedly there have been a lot of deaths in this regard, but this topic went unnoticed. There's no policy regarding what to do with people who have been wrongly accused, women who have been wrongly accused and killed. So, this is the project that we have recently started. It's been few months, so we are still collecting data. And due to COVID cases, we could not continue our field study right now. So any day, I can talk about it in detail once we are done with the project. So here today, I'll be talking about Toru Dutt, and I have a PPT to share with you. So let me see. Okay. So I'm starting now.
Yes, we can see your PPT. It's
Okay. So, the topic today is I have to discuss two poems by Toru Dutt. And as you are familiar with the name Toru Dutt, so in literature, when we start talking about poems and poets, we generally begin with a biographical description. So, keeping that custom, Toru Dutt died very young. She was born in 1856 and died in 1877 at the young age of 21. And but her youth and her premature death did not limit her creativity. She has written abundantly, and she has written in such a variety that there's a lot to discuss and there's a lot of critical interpretation open for her works. So she remains one of the greatest 19th century English and French writer, poetess, and translator. She was well versed in 4 languages, that is French, English, Sanskrit, and Bengali. And you can call her that she was the first woman poet in the Indian English tradition. And also she was the first Indian woman poet who wrote in French or who wrote about French. She has been popularly classified as a Christian Hindu with a French heart, and she earned a global literary repute posthumously. So only one collection, that is The Sheaf, was published during her lifetime, and rest of her collections followed after her death. So, but there are critics who comment that even if there was a single publication of Sheaf, it would not limit her popularity. That was such a gripping creativity that she had rendered in her work. Now, because of her premature death, she died at a young age of 21, and that too because of consumption, that is tuberculosis. She has often been compared with Keats. Even her writing style, the elements of romanticism. She's always been compared with British romantics. There are critics who have made allusions and comparisons with Byron as well. So this is further, if you want to have a research based on Toru Dutt, then you can go through these topics. Now, this is a French critic, James Darmister. He says of her that this daughter of Bengal, so admirably and so strangely gifted, Hindu by race and tradition, an English woman by education, a French woman at heart, poet in English, prose writer in French, who at the age of 80 made India acquainted with the poets of France and the rhyme of England, who blended in herself 3 souls and 3 traditions, and died at the age of 20 in the full bloom of her talent and on the eve of the awakening of her genius, presents in the history of literature a phenomenon without parallel. So this closely sums up the biography, what Toru Dutt was. I'll proceed with the context of history, her evolution, her thematic evolution in the coming slides. Now, a brief introduction to her writings. These are her important works. A Sheaf Gleaned in French Fields. She published this. When we come to biography, Toru Dutt had a brother and a sister. Brother died very young at the age of 14, and then her sister also passed away, and then she passed away. So all 3 died of consumption. And she wrote this 1876 collection of French writings. She translated it into English along with her sister. So there are some 8 works that her sister has also contributed in this collection. This was published during her lifetime, and there were 2 additional editions to this work, but she did not survive to see the further editions. In 1878, she wrote Bianca, or the Young Spanish Maiden, which is considered an autobiographical novel because despite she was discussing a Spanish maiden, she actually framed a character on her own sentimentality, like her own experiences when she moved from India to Europe for a brief stay of 4 years. In 1879, this was a large journal, Mademoiselle des Hours, a novel which the title is French, but the novel was English. And this is a fragmentary novel because this novel was never completed. And then is her work, Ancient Ballads and Legends of Hindustan, which was published in 1882. And the 2 poems that we have to discuss today are from the same collection, taken from the same collection. Now, the most interesting part is the motives and themes of her writing. You can see that death, alienation, nostalgia, remembrance, nature and celebration, anguish and anxiety. These are some redundant themes in her writings. Whatever writing from whichever period you take, these themes would be there. But then, a young girl writing in those times, in the colonial times, you can clearly illustrate, if you go through her works, you can illustrate that there is an evolution of her themes. When you see this Sheaf Gleaned in French Fields, there's a motive to spread the message of French or to spread the culture of French through her English writing so that people who cannot read French are able to read English. Now, she wrote at a time when cultural studies did not evolve. Cultural studies is something very new to us right now. So now we can talk a lot about cultural studies, but during that period, cultural studies had no one has actually heard about it. So she is considered by several critics as a cultural icon because what she did was she talked about cultural entities in different languages, and she used language to spread the message of culture, to bring about the awareness of culture. So in her first writing, she was simply translating because she had studied in a French school at that time. She was in Europe for 4 years. At the prime time of her life, she had her higher education in France, in Europe. And then from there, her knowledge of French, her knowledge of English, she used it to simply translate. Later in life, when she came back from England, when she came back from Europe, then she started reading Indian literature. She worked well and became very fluent with Sanskrit and Bengali. And then she read text in Sanskrit and Bengali, ancient traditional texts. And then she translated them into English again. So from there, she started interrogating feminist issues like concerns of women, women issues and female identity through characters like Sita and through whatever was happening around her. There was a lot that she wrote about women issues. Then, when she returned from Europe, then she thought, also, we will come back to history and then I'll let you know how she converted to Christianity. So, when she converted to Christianity, she belonged to a very elite Bengali Hindu class of caste Hindus. She belonged to Dutt family. She had an intellectual lineage. Ramesh Chand Dutt was her cousin. So there were so many important literary people, intellectual people in her family, and all of them converted to Christianity. And then after they converted to Christianity, the Bengal environment, the Indian environment, basically, they turned hostile towards the family, and then she made a shift to Europe. So when she shifted to Europe for 4 years, she could not escape the taunt and the discrimination that she felt in that society. And maybe that was due to her color or due to her origin, due to her ethnicity. So from there, she started talking about Indian culture in more detail. And that is how her themes shifted from simple romantic description and romantic writings to ethnicity and counter colonialism. Like she wrote at a time when India was criticized severely, and there was a lot going on in India regarding colonial invasion and the coming of Indian education system, the reformation of Indian education system. So there was a lot which was said against India, especially in terms that India was once glorious, it had a glorious past, but now it is in ruins. So she wanted to counteract all those accusations. So she glorified Indian in whatsoever terms possible, in whatso Indianness she could bring about to her readers. So that's why we associate her with recovered and reinvented tradition. And obviously there's nostalgia and interrogation of the past, which she does through her personal subjective writings, as well as through her legends and mythological figures that she undertakes. So I think this must be clear how her motives have evolved over time. And also because she was associated with French language, people also consider her as a popular figure of Francophone literature. Critics have always commented upon the sentimental and poetic reminiscence evident in her writings and characterization. Okay, now this is very important. Whenever you read a text, whenever you read a literary text, it's very important to understand the historical context of it. You cannot read a text without the history of it. So, coming through this, there are four major incidents that had centered around the time while Toru Dutt was writing. That was the mid-19th century. India was under colonial influence. India was being ruled by Britishers. And revolt of 1857, which we call as the First War of Independence and they call as the Sepoy Mutiny, was there. And there was loss of life, there was certain awakening, there was nationalism, there was patriotism, there was a lot of consideration of people wanting to have independence. Now there was on the socio-political front a huge loss, huge economic loss. Also, the English had a tight grip over India and they wanted to establish themselves and rule here as by any hook or crook. So in that wake of time, Bengal was the breeding ground of so many revolutions. Bengal has always been forward and Bengal has always been very strong in leading revolutions all over India. And it's a very famous quotation that what happens in Calcutta today happens in the rest of Bengal tomorrow. And what happens in Bengal today happens in rest of India tomorrow. So this is how Calcutta was heading, and Toru that belonged to Calcutta. She couldn't have evaded herself from all these incidents that was happening around. So second most important thing was Macaulay's Minute. So Macaulay published his minutes in 1835, talking about the importance of English education and how there was a need of intellectual Indians who should be able to speak English and understand English. So there's a bridge between the Indians who cannot speak English and the English who speak English and the Indians who speak English. So a lot was going on at that time. And during the wake, people were divided in India. Some Indians who were Orientalist by nature, who were very spiritual and religious, they would not allow English education to come to India. Whereas some of the Indians who were intellectuals, they wanted English education to come to India so that people are aware of the global changes and whatever is happening around the world. So that this opinion was divided, and it took a long time for English education to come to India. But among the intellectuals who talked of English education, there was also a section of Anglophiles. And when I talk about Anglophiles, they are the people who greatly admire England or English people. So Toru Dutt's family was basically Anglophile in nature. Toru Dutt's family talked about Anglophilic education. So they were very much impressed by the English culture, the English tradition, the English language. So they thought that only way to evolve out of the backwardness of Indian society was to adopt Englishness in everything possible. And in the wake of all these changes, there was one major conflict, and that was the coming up of Christianity, the conversion to Christianity. So many Indians were converted to Christianity, and this religious conversion happened at a very large scale. And Toru Dutt's family was one such family who was converted to to Christianity. Okay, so that was the historical background. And Toru Dutt serves as a cultural icon for her intricate details on Indianness in her works. She stood for the modern India, the slowly evolving India post the First War of Independence. So after the First War of Independence, Indian society was changing a great deal. And Toru Dutt can be seen as a precursor to all these changes. She described in good terms all the beauties of Indianness, all the beauties of Indian society through her later writings. Several changes took place in the socio-political Indian scenario, just like I explained right now. And of so many statements that were issued against the Indians, you can see that I've put a column there, that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. So Indians and Arabians and everyone in South Asia were taken in a very lower turn. There was a psychological brainwash of every Indian here in order to consider that English was superior to us in all terms. So there was resentment amongst a section of Indians, and also there was a approval amongst a section of Indians who believed that, okay, India has so many social evil practices. There is sati, there's a prohibition of widow remarriage. There is also child marriage. So many social evils were happening. There was caste system in India. There was communal angles in India. So in fact, there was a lot of confusion. So people thought that, some of the people, they thought that it's better to imitate the English in all possible way in order to have a better lifestyle. So in all the turmoils, in all that capacity, finally, Dutt's family converted to Christianity. But when they converted to Christianity altogether, their status, their high-class Hindu stature was lost. And then people were naturally hostile towards them, and it was very difficult to stay in Bengal at that time. They used to stay in a very posh cottage. It had a garden, and that garden was the breeding ground of so many of her Toru Dutt's work. So it was like one different space that the Dutt family had built for themselves. And there they stayed, and there Toru would observe the garden. She had ample opportunity to observe the garden and all its vegetation and everything. And there's the casuarina tree and all. So she took most of the content from that garden that was very own. And that was because the Dutt family were kind of ostracized from the society. They could not stay outside. People were very hostile towards them. And then they went to Europe. There also they faced discrimination. So they could not even adjust to the European soil. So they had to come back to India. So even after all these disturbance and everything, the conversion and all, the one positive and good thing was that Toru Dutt's mother had inculcated in her the love for her Indian classics. And she had been studying Indian classics since long, and she was deeply rooted and deeply critical on all those subjects. And by critical, I mean that she examined all the characters and she wrote about those mythical characters, and she tried to interrogate. So a young mind, as young as 18 and 20, and she used to read these things and then she commented upon it. So very well in present times we can call Toru Dutt that she is indeed a cultural icon. Now I'm coming to the first topic, and that is Casuarina tree. So as a student of literature, whenever you attempt poetry, it's very important for you to give a silent reading of the poem that you are about to attempt and then a loud reading. A loud reading will allow you to understand the rhythm, the rhyme, the tone, and everything of the poem. And a silent reading helps you to interpret the thematic structure of the poem. So before you proceed to any of the statements that critics have made or any of the research that has been already conducted on a poem, it's very important to form an opinion of your own. So this is the poem, and this is a 55-line poem of 5 stanzas with 11 lines in each stanza. And it's very symbolic. And there's a progression. When you see this poem, when you read this poem, there's a progression of theme, there's a progression of tone, and there's a lot of evolution as you move from the first to the last stanza. Now, Toru Dutt wrote this poem while she was in Europe. She was away from her country. And there is a lot of nostalgia involved in this poem. There's a lot of romanticism involved in this poem. There's a lot of nature worshipping, childhood memories, and so many things on the ground level that you can immediately associate and interpret with the first reading of the text. So, and if you continue further, you will be able to associate with a lot of cultural interpretations that this text involves. Now I'm beginning to read and give you a short introduction like that. My next slides have detailed description of the stanzas, which will be helpful to you when you refer to it later. So like a huge python winding round and round the rugged trunk, indented deep with scars up to its very summit near the stars, a creeper climbs, in whose embraces bound no other tree could live. But gallantly the giant wears the scarf, and flowers are hung in crimson clusters, all the boughs among, wherein all day are gathered buds and bees, and oft at nights the garden overflows with one sweet song that seems to have no close, sung darkling from our tree while men repose. Now this is immediately this is a very sensuous poem. All her senses are working. Now what she is doing is she's imagining this casuarina tree. And what is at work is sight. She's able to see and she's able to make that impression in the mind of the readers. Now, by the end of the stanza, you'll have a picture of casuarina tree, that it is some mighty, strong tree with a creeper, with an alongside creeper, which is hanging around the trunk. And that creeper has been compared to python. And the trunk is so sturdy and the grip is so hard that that trunk has got scars. And then when the creeper is bounding and the tree is bounding, both of them face towards the stars, face very high towards the top. And then at the top is a crimson cluster, that is the flower of the casuarina tree, which is crimson in color, which is again a very bright and attractive color at the top of the tree. And that can be compared as a crown of the tree. And there, birds and bees are attracted towards it and they come to it and then they sit there. And when there's a wind blowing, then the tree is so light that light in the sense that casuarina has been taken from the word casuary, which means the feathers of a bird. So when you see casuarina tree closely, I'll show you in the next slide, it has got such crisscross structure which tangle with each other as they move. So the movement is very beautiful and the sound produced due to this movement is so beautiful that she immediately says that that was a sweet song which would send people to sleep. And she's missing, she is perhaps not able to sleep here while she's in Europe, and she's missing that touch and that sound of the tree. On the ground level, this description on the stanza is very simple. It's about a tree that is in her garden. On the cultural icon level, this tree is symbolic of, again, two things. On a very basic level, you can say that this tree represents her nostalgia, her remembrance, her nativity, her childhood memories and everything. Or this is also a representation of Mother India. She stands erect like a tree, and then there's a creeper. These are the colonies which are coming and capturing her. And despite all the struggles, all the conquerors, all the conquests, she still stands tall. and she aims high and she looks high and she dreams of the independence, but she's got such beauty, such attraction, such glory at the top of her head that people are attracted. Birds and bees represent the colonies and the conquerors who have over time come and captured India. So there are so many levels of interpretation, but then you can choose your own as per your exam. In the second stanza, when first my casement is wide open. So in the first stanza, there was a subjective description of the tree, objective description of the tree. By objective, I mean that there's a general description of the tree as the tree would look to everybody. In the second stanza, there's a subjective description of the tree, and that refers to how the tree appears to Toru personally. So she explains that how this tree was the first thing she would see in the morning, and she was delighted seeing it. It was a very happy sight for her as soon as she opened her window. And then she explains that how this tree remained throughout the day, throughout the year, throughout the seasons. And then she explains all the activities that take place around the tree. Then shifts to the third stanza. Again, there's a very beautiful evolution of time as well. One is a remembrance that strikes her, and then she goes deeper into remembrance. Then she comes to associate why is that tree special to her. Now she says that it's not only because of the sturdiness or the magnificence of that tree that it is very special or I'm missing it at this moment. It's because it is very dear to my soul, because it's like a part of my life. It's like a part of my childhood. She had stayed there, she had played there, and there have been companions, and perhaps these companions are her siblings who died. And she says that for all those things, for all her personal associations with that tree, this tree will always remain special and dear. And then here, in memory till the hot tears blind mine eyes, what is that dirge like murmur that I hear, like the sea breaking on a shingle beach? It's the tree's lament and airy speech that happily to the unknown land may reach. Now, in this unknown land, which is she's not able to accept, despite her conversion, despite her love for the culture of Europe, she still says that this is an unknown land to me, and here, whatever is the murmur, when she's able to hear some of the waves rolling here or any of the disturbance in the time or place where she is, she immediately reconnects it with the casuarina tree, and she comes back to the present, and then again goes back to remembering the tree. Unknown yet well known to the eye of faith, I have heard that wail far, far away. In distant lands by many a sheltered bay, when slumbered in his cave, the water wrath and the waves gently kissed the classic shore of France or Italy beneath the moon. When earth lay tranced in a dreamless swoon, and every time the music rose before, mine inner vision rose a form sublime. Thy form, O tree, as in many happy prime, I saw thee in my own love's native clime. Now, so wherever she is and howsoever far she is from her place, she cannot forget the impression of that tree. So whenever there is a slight disturbance in the nature here, whenever there is anything beautiful or sensuous in nature in the place that she's presently at, she is immediately able to reconnect to the world that she belonged to. She closes her eyes, and every time she's able to understand from her inner vision, there's a feeling, there's a sense of how casuarina tree might be at this present time. So she always keeps missing that tree, and nature at this place, vegetation at this place is not able to please her or soothe her so much as that casuarina tree has. Therefore I fain would consecrate a lay unto thy honor, tree beloved of those who now in blessed sleep for I repose. Dearer than life to me, alas, were they. Mayst thou be numbered when my days are done with deathless trees like those in borrowed day, under whose awful branches lingered pale, fear, trembling, hope, and death, the skeleton, and time, the shadow, and the weak faint rehearse, may love defend the from oblivion's curse. Now the last stanza is a feeling of triumph. She talks of death, but then she talks of immortality. She talks about people who have been once a part of her memory, who have together performed activities under that casuarina tree, but are not alive anymore. But this tree remains immortal. This tree is a deathless tree. And here she makes comparisons to yew trees, which Wordsworth had written in his poem. And this was a tree that nobody knew about, but until Wordsworth immortalized that tree in his poem. So this is an attempt basically to talk about a tree like casuarina, which we must have not known unless Toru that speaks about it. And then she says that I may pass, I may die, but you will be a tree, an immortal tree, who would be defended from oblivion's curse, and you will remain forever. So this is how a cultural symbol with the childhood memory is put to use and made immortal in her writings. Now, these are some of the comments. This was published in 1881, and I have explained how she recollects her childhood memories through it. Casuarina takes its name from the Latin word casoveri, refers to fancied resemblance of the branches to the feathers of the bird. So, despite the might and the strength of the tree, the branches are very fragile and they move very beautifully. And then this is how the rhythm flows. British poetry, British romanticism can easily be seen in this poem, traces of it, and people say that she has been inspired by Wordsworth for most part of her writing, especially in this theme. Then we see how everything evolves. Like in stanza 1, this creeper like python can be anything. It can be all the colonies that are coming in, or the memories, or the, so you can associate it with whatever interpretation suits you. And because there's an angle of cultural studies to it, so when you're taking it in a cultural context, it's better to associate it with the history of that time and how conquest and conquerors were there at that particular period. And on a simple romantic level, it's just about nostalgia and remembrance. This is how the casuarina tree looks, and this crimson is the crown. This is the flowers of that tree in the picture that I've attached. Now, I've told you there's an objective beginning to this poem, in which moves to subjective portion, and then when you see the two stanzas, they are simply related to definition of poetry as said by Milton: simple, sensuous, and impassionate. Stanza 3 is again her memory. Why is that so special? And finally, this poem ends with a sense of triumph, immortality over death. Now I'm moving to the second poem. I can go in detail, but we don't have much time. Okay, Bagmari. So Bagmari is basically that special place where the Dutt family used to sit. It's her garden, and it's again very personal. And it's a very beautiful poem, a very simple poem of the garden that every one of us see. And then we see that what is most emphatic about the garden is the colors, the variety of colors. And then this is how Bagmari is described by Toru. So she says, a sea of foliage guards our garden round, but not a sea of dull, unvaried green. Sharp contrast of all colors here are seen. The light green, graceful tamarinds abound, amid the mango clumps of green profound. So she immediately makes a contrast that this, the vegetation and the kind of variety that she has in her garden appears like a sea of unvaried green, of so many colors or so many shades of green. And then there's a light green, graceful tamarinds, but the mango tree is very dark in color, very dark green in color. And palms arise like pillars gray between. And these palms, they are put in between and they appear like pillars, gray in color. And over the quiet pools, the seam is leaves. And red and startling like a trumpet sound, but nothing can be lovelier than the ranges of bamboos to the eastward when the moon looks through their gaps and the white lotus changes into a cup of silver. So she profoundly seems like she's taking you to a ride in her garden, and she goes on explaining how these trees change their color and how many kinds of trees are available. But she says that from green, then there are grays, then there are reds, then the favorite, she says, is bamboo to the eastward. It is lovelier than the mangoes. She finds the bamboos very appealing because when the moon looks through their gaps, because moonlight comes filtered through these bamboo trees, and there it strikes the lotus, and the lotus immediately changes its color to silver. One might swoon drunken with beauty then, or gaze and gaze on a primeval Eden in amaze. So she's so mesmerized by the beauty of her garden that she compares it with the Garden of Eden. And then this is again a reference to her Christianity, her conversion, and also her repose, that she finds her peace and her happiness in this particular garden, which is very personal to her, and she tries to explain it to the people. Now, this is a sonnet, and this has got the same rhyming scheme. And Bagmari is a place in Calcutta which was their silent repose of the Dutt family after they were ostracized from the society. And Bagmari has casuarina trees also there, lotus plant is also there, all the plants that she has ever talked about. The poetess describes the scenic beauty of garden in this sonnet, attempts to caricate the variety and chromatic abundance everywhere. She makes use of different colors to describe the trees and plantations there. She simply describes all plants and then shifts from the aesthetic appeal of these plants to the natural essence of everything around and what significance these plants have for her as well. She draws an analogy between her domestic garden with that of the Garden of Eden. That speaker mentions the intoxicating quality of the plant's beauty and suggests that the garden represents a type of primeval Eden. This allusion to the Bible not only underscores the religious and spiritual significance that Dutt invests in nature, but also the importance of Christianity and Christian imagery to that. The speaker observes in her garden almost every planted tree in a specific shade of bloom, tamarinds to mangoes, palms and simals to bamboo and lotus plants. The poem is a simple lyric poem, one which seeks merely to describe the pleasure and beauty that the speaker finds in her garden home. It is organized in a way that effectively conveys the momentum and importance of various images through the sonnet form, and it uses more simple vernacular English than the poems of Dutt's translations. Here in Bagmari, we are thus not just brought into the private space of Dutt's garden, but also the private space of her internal reflections and meditations, and how fascinated she is with nature, and how she uses poetry to give voice to the world's natural beauty. And this ends here. This is the best I could do within this time.
Thank you, Dr. Sana, for that wonderful introduction to one of our most important poets. I don't really know what to say because we don't know Toru Dutt as well as we should, given her importance, as you have brought out. And our unfamiliarity with her poetry puts us on a little bit of a, even though given the richness of her poetry and the fact that she was writing at such a young age, and that she was a woman, and her obvious felicity with the verse, she should be regarded as not just a feminist icon, not just a poet, an important poet, but also somebody who came at a period of a very critical change in India's mindset towards English education. English education, yes, because that particular period in which she is writing, that is the period when the conflict between whether India should adopt a more traditional education or whether it should go towards English education, a more modern English education. That is the period when that entire debate is taking shape. So thank you for bringing all of that out. I was very fascinated by both the poems, especially the first one. I thought, as you rightly pointed out, we can see the effects of different romantic poets. There is definitely Wordsworth there, but in the last stanza especially, there is also Coleridge, I thought, with the sudden dark imagery of skeletons under the tree and so on. I don't know. Perhaps you can comment on that, whether you would agree. I also thought there was something of Keats there, but anyway, I mean, yeah. But and there is also the sense. I mean, and these are some other thoughts that that when you read something like this, that come almost unbidden to your mind, which is that she is writing about nature in a very English tradition at a time when India is convulsed with great change. This is a period when India is trying to come to terms with foreign occupation, and the fact that, I mean, there is something of her privilege that comes through. I'm a little sorry for saying this, but there's nothing social about her poetry. At least the ones that we have looked at, that you have looked at in this in your lecture, and that is only possible when you belong to a certain privileged class, when you are able to cut yourself off from the everyday concerns of the people. And obviously, uh, her access to English education, to French education, etc., could only be furnished, could only be available. The entire garden, in fact, could only be available because people. So, these are of course are thoughts that are unconnected to her poetry, but given our current uh, tendency to read social issues into poetry, into literature and art, they come in. But anyway, there are a lot of questions that are there, and there are people who want to put them to you. So I'll now just go over to my friend Anindya, who I would request to put those questions on screen. So that's your first question. Uh,
Okay, I'll take the questions, but I'll extend a comment on what you were saying. So I agree with that privileged point of view. She has, I took her, even I discussed her as a cultural poet, more of a cultural poet rather than a social critic or something like that. She was more interested in cultural comparisons. And she has also taken cultural entities through whether it's be legends or mythologies. So she was definitely privileged because a lot of people from her family were civil servants. You must have heard about Ramesh Chandra Dutt, her cousin, who was an economist and a well-versed civil servant at that time, and they were considered as very close allies of English people. And obviously belonging to Bengal, that was again a very privileged kind of association because elite Hindu class of the Bengali family. So the fact you can imagine Toru Dutt with a palatial place and then a garden and then she's sitting there and then writing. So it is definitely a luxury. And again, a very young death did not give her much access to the world outside. Also, she comments that she made very good friends in Europe while she was in Europe, and when she returned to India, she used to write letters to her friends. She never mentions any of her Indian friends except for her siblings, who died young again. So when she came back to India, she wrote a letter to her European friend, and she told that I'm not liking India. Actually, when since I have come back, people have started questioning that why didn't I get married? So again, the same pressure at that time as well. So she was critical of Indian culture, and after her conversion to Christianity, she was extremely rigid towards the culture as well. But then, when she witnessed the same hostility in the European society, she tried to study the Indian mythology and the deep culture in her own perspective. So that is what I would like to add. And I agree that you can compare Toru Dutt with Keats as well, with Wordsworth as well, with Shelley as well, Coleridge as well. There's a lot of undiscovered approach to her study still there. Okay, now I can take questions. Okay, what is your opinion about the role of sense of isolation, personal, religious, social, intellectual in Dutt's poetic career? Okay, so in her poetic career, I see that there's a trace of evolution and how she is developing on all fronts. When it comes to religious, when it comes to personal, okay, personal is like how she makes use of personal elements, especially from her garden, especially from her domestic life and for her family. She does not again step into the social concerns. She is very limited to her domestic sphere. We also have to consider the point that she was a woman. She was a woman in Indian society. So naturally, even if she was an elite class of Indian, she did not have much access to the Indian society. She could not be allowed to roam outside her home so easily. So her personal kind of space is limited. That is very evident through her poems, the kind of cultural comparisons she make and the tools that she uses. On the religious front, we have a lot of interpretation in this ground or religious. She has never been so vocal about it, but naturally there's a transition once she converted to Christianity and then she came back to India to rediscover the culture. I think Toru Dutt was very modern in approach. Maybe she was more like us. Like we are people, we do not place religion before our culture. So howsoever religious we are more indebted to our cultural outline. So that is how she took religion. Because even when she converted to Christianity, we can see that mentioning Eden in her poems, or comparing to some biblical grounds, or making comparison to something English, that comes out of her knowledge of cultural exposure. And then when she comes to Indian context of religion, she has not written much about the Hinduism in that light, but on the religious front, she talks about in ballads she has written about Sita, Lakshman, Bharat. So many mythological characters she has taken. These are other poems that we have not covered today in our presentation, but these are the poems where she tries to evaluate the spiritual connotation. There's a very famous poem on Buddha and Bharat and the kind of tyag system in India, where she comments that according to her, again, that's her perspective, she says that according to her, someone abandoning the family duties, family responsibilities, and society as whole, and then going back to seek wisdom in isolation is wrong. She says that it's better to love people, be involved with people, and have a family of your own in order to understand the real definitions of love and humanity and dependence and existence. So, in that point of view, her religious context, I think, was very forward and very critical, and she used to extract the best she could from both the religions. And she has not specifically written about any religion, whether positive or negative. On the social front, again, the same thing. She did not have much of a social life. On the intellectual front, yes, she was well read, and she was actually very much of interested in education, because when she returned from Europe, and she was already well versed in English and French, she already had a collection published, and in spite of all that fame, she came back to study Indian tradition. She after her education in the English medium and French medium, she started reading Sanskrit, and then she was so well versed in Sanskrit that she read all the epics of Indian culture, and then she also studied Bengali. So she went on. So with that role of isolation, like since she did not have much of a social life and much of an elaborate circle, she, I think, made best use of her 21 years of existence in developing in all the fronts she could. I think I'm clear now. Okay. How did Toru Dutt overcome the overlapping morphology of language and experience as a translator? Okay, now this is like her role as a translator. When you go to the Wikipedia page, Wikipedia credits her as a poetess. So many critics have talked about her as a as an first Indian woman writing in French. So people or critics have always evaluated her in terms of she being a poet, or she being a writer, or she being just an author. Not much has been commented on she being a translator. Rather than attributing translator to her identity, critics have found it better to call her a cultural icon, because she translates the cultural sentiments of a place. So, like I explained, that since cultural studies was not in vogue at those times, while she used to write, there's a very simple poem called Lotus by Toru Dutt. And the poem is very simple. Again, it's from her garden. She says that lily and rose, they are fighting with each other as to establish which of these flowers is more beautiful. And ultimately, there's a lot of discussion on all levels: the color of the flower, the appearance of the flower, the use of the flower. And the conclusion is that lotus is more beautiful than rose and lily, because lotus has the traits of both rose and lily. On a intrinsic level, it's nothing. It's just a simple fight of flowers and establishing that lotus is a beautiful flower. But when you go into the cultural details of it, lotus is something very Indian to us, something very indigenous to us. And rose and lily are something that we have borrowed. They are a breed of English, if you go in detail about it. So rose is red in color, the red rose, or then the lily, which is a whitish, pale pinkish, and then lotus gets a pale pinkish color, which can be a blend of both these things. So with this simple poem, with the comparison amongst the three flowers, Toru Dutt is able to establish that lotus is better because India is better and that culture is better. So she translates her sentiments through cultural symbols. Now, translations, whatever she has worked upon, she also tells during her writings that her motive was to let the English people know about French what they do not know about French. And it is very sad indeed to tell that after her death, after Toru Dutt died, the French were able to recover her literature, whatever she wrote about France, and they call her Francophonic literature. And then they were able to realize that Toru Dutt has amazingly worked as a translator in in bringing to awareness about French culture to English people and the non-French speaking society. So basically, her intention as a translator was in order to spread this. So it's not more about morphology of language. I think because she was well versed in all the four languages, I don't think she must have faced that constraints, because owing to the fame and popularity of her first collection, that Sheaf, it is evident in itself that it has been a powerful translation. Next. I can see a very interesting question in the comment. How could she not leave Indian culture after her conversion? So, culture is a different thing. Religion is a different thing. There are so many Christians in India. They subscribe more to the Indian culture. Also, uh, every religion, like a Muslim, even a Muslim, we are Indian Muslim is always different from a Pakistani Muslim or a Gulf Muslim or a Muslim from the Middle East, because we carry our culture too. The culture has to influence you. You cannot escape that culture. So her conversion had nothing to do leaving her culture. Also, her mother had inculcated in her a lot of love for traditional and classic texts of India, like the Gita, the Mahabharata, and she had read them all. So she was really mesmerized with that culture, and it's evident in all her writings. Okay. Do you think Dutt's visit to Europe and learning of English and French literature affected her understanding in India's mythology and ancient religious thoughts and her patriotism? Yes, definitely. She says that when she comes back from Europe, okay, coming to the historical context, India at that time, it was, mid 19th century. The revolt of 1857 had happened, and Indian education system was drastically reformed. The missionaries from Europe had come to India to start teaching English, and a lot of Englishness had suddenly crept in the Indian society. So people were naturally attracted towards English society, and whatever they read about the English society. Like even if they read a novel, it would carry the names like Tom had this and Daisy had that. They did not read about what happened to Ram or Indian characters or Indian society or Indian mohallas. So they were immediately psychologically disconnected from their society and were attracted towards English society. And these elite class of Indians, they used to read novels and they used to read more about English education. And then naturally there was a fancy to know more about the European culture. So when all this happened, and owing to Toru Dutt's Anglophile family, everybody converting to Christianity, everybody appreciating the English sentimentality, the English system, and then they thought that since Bengal had turned really hostile towards the Dutt family after their conversion, they went to Europe. And there in Europe, they faced a lot of criticism because of ethnicity, the color of her skin, or whatever values she was carrying. So she could not accommodate herself even in the European culture. So what was more intrinsic to her was the values that she learned in her native place, and that is India, and that is Calcutta. And then coming back from Europe, she tried to re-interrogate, and because she began her study of Sanskrit after her return from Europe, so she started studying the Indian classics, and then immediately she was very fascinated by Indian classics, and that has certainly affected her growth, and that has her conversion has really made her draw a very beautiful comparison. And it's always important whenever you make a comparative religious study, you're always able to scrutinize it better as to what religion has what to offer. And then I strictly believe that everywhere all the religions, they connote, they combine, and there's a message of singleness to be spread by religion. So I agree with that fact that yes, that her European exposure is mainly responsible for re-interrogating Indian culture. Okay, Taruda's poem always illustrates strong symbolic overtones. Did it hinder the impulsiveness of her works? I think no. Going around with the two poems that we have covered today, there is symbolism, but there is multiple interpretation. You can interpret in whatever way possible. It could be that Toru Dutt simply wrote it just reminiscing her childhood. So we did not for even a second feel that she deviated from her topic, or she could not speak about her childhood, or she missed a part of it. So I think the basic also remains, and then there's a scope for multiple interpretation. So her symbolism did not affect her creativity or impulsiveness.
Do we have more questions or? Okay, I have a comment to make about two of the questions that were asked. One was about the fact that how is it that she could come back to her culture even after converting to Christianity, and the second was regarding the fact that she seems to have been drawn to Indian culture, especially after her stay in Europe. I find both of these things very reminiscent of what we see today. People migrate to part of some part, some Western country, and they get a culture shock over there, and we suddenly find that they have a very revivalist uh, love for their culture, and they
Yes.
become, in some sense, more Indian than Indians who are actually living in India, more Pakistani than Pakistanis who are actually living in Pakistan, and so on and so forth. Because of that,
Okay, I'll interrupt here with that Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, that film. It was created with the sole intention of letting the Indian audience know that how people who do not live in India and then they shift to US or someone, that was that was the story there, that Amrish Puri is very much staunch about getting his daughter married to Indian culture, to an Indian boy too. So Indianness is like more rooted towards people. Like people do not forget their roots. Again, that sense of belonging and sense of nativity. So that remains. You can go anywhere, but you do not forget your culture.
and you seem to have a special hankering for it when you find that culture under threat, when you
Yes.
feel that it might be eroded away in you and in your children and in their children, and that there might come a time when nothing Indian would remain in them. That is especially when you become protective of it, and more
Yes.
protective than people who are, a little more casual about it. So that was one thing, and the second thing is about her adoption of Christianity. I find that to be a very middle class thing to do, in some ways, because it's a social progress kind of a move, since it's, I mean, they had educationally and culturally already aligned themselves to the ruling class, but then they moved one step further and also adopted their religion. Yeah, and I do not know whether we should see this move more in terms of a change of belief. I would rather see it more in terms of a social calculus, as a educated gamble on which way the country would move and what you needed to acquire, what skills you needed to have, what cultural leaning you needed to have to actually acquire that. Bengal did that very well. And in some sense, the Bengali Bhadralok of that period were way ahead of their time, in the sense that the rest of India uh,
Yes, sir.
did not have that kind of middle class. We, of course, now that we belong to the middle class ourselves, we understand what it is. We also tend to inculcate in our children, in ourselves, those specific skills which we think would be necessary for them in their lives. And I think
Yes.
that was exactly what Toru that was doing when she changed her religion. And to my mind, that would be the more that would be the better lens to look at that phenomena.
I agree.
Uh, so if we have no more questions, before we end, I'll just like to introduce our speakers for tomorrow at 10:30. That would be our first session. We have our very own Mr. Atanu Kumar Paul, Assistant Professor of JMS College, Munger University. He would be speaking on Hopkins as a precursor of modern poetry. And then we have at 11:30 Dr. Soumya Mohan Ghosh, Assistant Professor of Purbasthali College, West Bengal, and his topic is Aversion from the Margin, Articulation of Female Self, and Kamala Das, an introduction. Thank you, thank you, Dr. Sana, and thank you to everybody who has joined us today for this
Thank you,
session.
everyone. Thank you
Please
so
have a
much for
good
giving
day.
me this opportunity.
We
Hope
were
it
very
was.
glad to have you. That was a very That was a wonderful lecture, and I do realize that in some ways, perhaps Toru that has not got as much attention that she should have. So thank you once again, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Okay, sir. Thank you.